Thank you very much for joining us. For those utilizing ASL interpretation services, our two ASL interpreters today will be Craig Ridgway and Lisa Dennett. Their instructions on how to pin their videos will be in the chat. You can feel free to find them at ASL Interpreter Ridgway or ASL Interpreter Craig Ridgway and ASL Interpreter Sign Nexus Lisa Bennett. Also, for those utilizing CART services, those instructions will be in the chat as well. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Arva Rice. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the interim chair of the Civilian Complaint Review Board. I would like to call the CCRB's June public board meeting to order. Will the board please introduce themselves now, starting to my right with Pat.
Pat Smith, mayoral appointee from Manhattan. Good evening. How are you?
Good afternoon. Kevin Jamot, mayoral appointee from Queens.
Good afternoon. Joe Fox, police commissioner designee from Rockaway.
Herman Merritt, City Council designee from Brooklyn.
Good afternoon, John Snegal. I'm one of the mayoral appointees.
Members who are joining us virtually, I want to start with Frank. If you would introduce yourself, please.
I'm Frank Dwyer. I'm a police commissioner designee, and I am traveling, so I'm joining you remotely.
June Northern, mayoral appointee from Brooklyn.
Charlene Brown Wyans, police commissioner designee.
Would you repeat your introduction? You got cut off.
Apologies. Charlene Brown Wyans, police commissioner designee.
Thank you. And June, did you introduce yourself as well?
I did. June Northern, mayoral appointee from Brooklyn.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
You Hogan.
Is there anyone else on the line?
You Hogan, city council designee from the borough of Queens.
Terrific. Thank you so much, AU, for joining us as well. Are there any corrections or changes to the May public board meeting minutes? Any changes or corrections? Okay. Seeing none, can I ask for a motion to approve the May board meeting minutes? Can I have a second? All those in favor? All those opposed? Okay, the meeting minutes are approved as presented. It has been 4 years since the murder of George Floyd. 4 years ago, our city and many other cities saw massive protest. As I said at our last meeting, New York City had a long and vibrant history of political protest. It appears this summer will be no exception, as demonstrations continue in regard to the Israel-Palestine conflict. The CCRB remains committed to investigating any misconduct that may occur during the policing of these protests. To date, the CCRB has conducted 32 investigations into alleged police misconduct at Middle East protests around the city. Of those complaints, 6 took place on college campuses. In total, the complaints involved 66 subject officers, with 14 subject officers involved in campus complaints. This afternoon, the CCRB welcomes representatives from the New York City Civil Liberties Union, the Legal Aid Society, and the Office of the Attorney General, who are here to give a presentation on the settlement that they reached with the NYPD related to the 2020 protest. This settlement was reached with the NYPD with the aim of reforming how we police protest in New York City. This presentation is a great opportunity for the board and the public to learn more about the settlement's impact on policing in the city and how it may impact the work of the agency. On behalf of the board, I'd like to thank NYCLU, Legal Aid, and the Office of the Attorney General for taking the time to present to us today. We will now hear from Executive Director Jonathan Darsh. John?
CCRB received in 2023 when compared to 2022. Then, in January 2024, the agency implemented a program to focus our resources by closing complaints that only contained certain types of allegations. Since then, closed or referred complaints without investigation. If those complaints were still on the agency's open docket, the docket would be 2,491 complaints. So far this year, the agency received 2,355 complaints within our jurisdiction. This is only 3.8% of 2023's pace, but is still 63.6% ahead of 2022's pace. While the staff and board members of the agency remain committed to serving New Yorkers and fulfilling our charter mandate, the impacts of the current budget situation cannot be understated. We remain hopeful that the city's new budget will restore the agency's capacity to investigate all misconduct within our jurisdiction so as to better meet the needs of New Yorkers. Our office is open for walk-in complaints, but it is also possible to file complaints online at nyc.gov/CCRB complaint, by telephone at 1-800-341-2272, by dialing 311 and saying that you would like to make a complaint about a police officer, or by tagging the agency on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. If anyone wishes to file a complaint right now, we have 2 investigators on hand, ready to take new complaints. We also have someone from the Civilian Assistance Unit to help them. The investigators on call this afternoon are Emma Steidehar and Idan Falek, and Ruth Villafane is here from the Civilian Assistance Unit. Chair Rice?
Do any members of the board have any questions for our executive director? Any questions for our executive director? On the line? Okay. If not, we will now hear a presentation about policing at protests from Molly Bilkin, Associate Legal Director at NYC LU.
Thank you very much, members of the board. Good afternoon. I'm Molly Bicklin, the Associate Legal Director of the NYCLU, and I'm happy to be here with my colleague Daniel Lambright, Senior Staff Attorney, Jenvin Wong from the Legal Aid Society, Travis England, and Lillian Marquez from the New York Attorney General's Office. So, as mentioned, the settlement agreement we are discussing here today resolves 4 consolidated cases that were filed to seek redress for the NYPD's response to the protests following the May 25th, 2020 murder of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis. These 4 cases allege that the NYPD engaged in unconstitutional policing, using excessive force and arresting protesters, journalists, and legal observers without probable cause at racial justice protests in New York City beginning in late May of 2020. I can advance the slide. Thank you. So I know that these protests are familiar to the board and many people in New York City. Many of the incidents that were the subject of the cases were investigated by the CCRB. And as this board found in its 2022 report on the protest response, there were patterns of misconduct in the NYPD protest response. And the board also found that 146 officers committed misconduct and recommended disciplinary charges. So after these 4 lawsuits were filed, the sergeants, detectives, and police officers unions, the PBA, SBA, and the DEA intervened. And after more than 2 years of very intense litigation, the city, the plaintiffs, the DEA, and the SBA union settled. So the parties to the settlement are the Attorney General's Office, the plaintiffs in the Payne, Gray, and Rolland cases, the City of New York, the SBA, and the DEA. The PBA did not enter into the agreement and has challenged it. That matter is on appeal, but the settlement is currently in effect. So I'm going to provide an overview and then turn it over to my colleagues for the specifics. So the settlement agreement is phased. It has 3 phases. In phase 1, which is our current phase, the NYPD develops policies, procedures, and training to implement the settlement. Phase 2 then begins 45 days after the NYPD adopts these updated policies and procedures that were developed in phase 1. There is then a 3-year compliance period during phase 2, during which a collaborative committee that includes representatives of the plaintiffs, the Attorney General's office, the NYPD, the City of New York, and the Department of Investigation will review compliance and make recommendations. And then phase 3 is a 12 months of continued court jurisdiction to ensure compliance. Okay. So, writ large, the settlement creates a new senior role within the NYPD to oversee response to public demonstrations. This is the First Amendment activity senior executive. It also establishes a 4-tiered protest response system, with one of the primary goals being to facilitate the First Amendment rights of protesters. It alters and formalizes practices around crowd control, use of force, and mass arrest processing centers, and incorporates current patrol guide policies in several areas, including treatment of legal observers, and institutes new policies and procedures for treatments of the press and those recording protests. Okay. It also establishes this oversight committee, the collaborative committee that I mentioned before, creates new requirements for documenting protest response to assist in that oversight, and incorporates an aggravating factor for disciplinary in the disciplinary matrix for protest misconduct. Okay. One of the linchpins of the settlement is this new senior role for response to protests and to manage compliance. This role is from within the police department. It must be at a deputy chief or above and work in connection with the department's legal bureau. This position will take an active role in preparing the new policies, procedures, and training, and also of the department's response to anticipated protest, and participate in after-action reviews as necessary. But this senior executive role does not replace the incident commander tasked with managing on the ground. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jen.
Thank you for having us here today. Let's see if I can just, okay. Going a little bit more into detail in one of the areas of the agreement that has gained a lot of attention is NYPD's red light, green light policy as part of the tiered response system. And what this does is it formalizes and implements a red light, green light policy where there are red light offenses, offenses that are designated as those that require the approval of the rank of captain or above before a line officer can make an authorized arrest. And these include common protest offenses like obstruction of governmental administration, violation of emergency orders, disorderly conduct, and other VTL, vehicle and traffic law offenses. The identity of the individual who authorized a red light arrest must be documented. Any offense that is not designated as a red light offense shall be considered what is called a green light offense, which means that individualized probable cause required for there would still be a requirement for individualized probable cause for each green light or red light arrest. Moving into the tiered response system, which is a central part of this settlement agreement. Tier 1, and this would be something that is central to phase 2. Tier 1 basically would be the presumptive tier unless other conditions are met. And this is in response to what was a rapid police response escalation during the 2020 protests. And this basically formalizes that NYPD should be responding with the softest touch possible at the outset for most demonstrations. So NYPD during Tier 1 may deploy protest liaisons from the Community Affairs Bureau. These individuals should be trained in effective communication with protesters, de-escalation, and crowd psychology, and should be tasked with the primary goal of facilitating First Amendment activity. This role is to communicate with protesters and demonstrators. It would be it would prioritize establishing a dialogue with protest leaders to help facilitate this First Amendment activity. Patrol officers may be deployed to reroute vehicle or pedestrian traffic. And officers cannot be drawn from the SRG unit, the Strategic Response Group, and cannot carry equipment associated exclusively with those units. And moving between the tiers would require specific conditions to be met. And so for tier 2, the incident commander, in consultation with the First Amendment Activity Senior Executive, the FAA Senior Executive, has to believe that there are green light violations that are imminent or that there is a serious risk that the crowd size will obstruct critical infrastructure. And so this provides a measure of discretion for the incident commander and the FAA Senior Executive to make the decision to move to tier 2 if needed. In this tier, NYPD will be able to dispatch protest liaisons, officers for traffic control, as well as additional officers that could be staged off scene, if at all possible out of the view of protesters, but certainly nearby in order to be able to be deployed quickly. If a tier 3 or tier 4 winds up being authorized by the incident commander with the FAA Senior Executive. So this deployment must also be proportional to the threat, and they should be removed when the threat has been resolved. Tier 3, implementation of Tier 3 must also be authorized by the incident commander in consultation with the FAA Senior Executive. In Tier 3, if there's individualized probable cause to arrest individuals engaged in either green light offenses or authorized red light offenses, then NYPD officers may make arrests based on that approval and authorization. NYPD can deploy an appropriate number of officers to address specific individuals engaged in these offenses. And in Tier 3, SRG may be deployed, but only for as long as is necessary and proportional to address the specific situation. Protest liaisons and patrol officers may also be deployed to address traffic and should continue to facilitate this First Amendment activity. I'd like to note also that the tiers do not have to be moved through in a sequential order. It is based specifically on what the circumstances of each demonstration may present at that time. And so it does not mean that a demonstration must move from tier 1 to tier 2 before meeting tier 3. It may be that there may be circumstances that allow an incident commander and a FAA senior executive to determine that a demonstration has moved from a tier 1 to a tier 3. It also means that a demonstration that is in tier 3 may also move back down to tier 2 or tier 1 based on the specific facts on the ground. Tier 4 is based on the approval of the incident commander and FAA senior executive, is if there are protesters seeking to gain unauthorized entry, or if they're physically blocking others' entry into a sensitive location, if there's engagement in criminal offenses or trespass of 3rd degree or higher, would allow officers to engage in targeted efforts to address green light offenses or widespread instances of riot, incitement to riot, or unlawful assembly. However, those offenses cannot be, the offenses have to be continued to be unabated. They cannot be addressed through further de-escalation or targeted enforcement. So they also may move to disperse a protest, and the crowd must be provided the opportunity to disperse and be provided with information that allows them to disperse, so that demonstrators have the information they need in order to disperse in an orderly fashion. They must be audible to the entire crowd. Exit points must be clearly identified. Protesters must be able to be directed to where they may continue to lawfully demonstrate and protest whenever possible. Some of the offenses that some of the misconduct that we saw and that were complained about from the 2020 protests included kettling. And so part of the tiered response system also addresses these tactics. And so NYPD cannot engage in widespread kettling, which is enclosing all individuals with an intent to take police action against them without having individualized probable cause. However, NYPD can encircle individuals within a crowd who are the target of a particular arrest, so that targeted arrests for either authorized red light offenses or for green light offenses can still be done. Individuals that are inadvertently encircled must be allowed to exit the formation immediately, and officers must help facilitate their exit. And this is in direct response to a lot of the misconduct that was observed and reported during the 2020 protests. As for use of force, many of these, much of what we're seeing here is actually already encompassed in NYPD policy, but it is reiterated in the agreement for clarity. For example, OC spray shall not be used at a demonstration unless there's use of physical force that is otherwise permitted by law or NYPD policy. Large volume OC spray can only be used by officers specifically trained in the use and authorized by a supervisor. It cannot be used in an indiscriminate manner or against peaceful protesters or those engaging in passive resistance. Bicycles cannot be used, may only be used consistent with the tiered approach and cannot be used indiscriminately as well. And flex cuffs must be checked regularly. NYPD must also have the necessary tools to remove and loosen them where appropriate and when requested. Another issue that came up frequently during the 2020 protests was the use of mass arrest processing centers, particularly during the Mott Haven protests, where many protesters were spread out amongst several different mass arrest processing centers. And so if the NYPD must establish one, it must be authorized by the senior executive or their designee. And NYPD is required to ensure that the location and contact information are readily available to the public via social media accounts, so that loved ones, defense attorneys are able to find those who are arrested and taken to mass arrest processing centers. And all people held must be provided with clean water, food, PPE, prompt access to telephones, and adequate medical care and restrooms, all of which is already part of NYPD policy as written. Other arrest processing requirements. Individuals other than juveniles must be processed in under 7.5 hours, except when there are particular circumstances that affect that, like emergency medical care, violation, if it is a violation, misdemeanor, felony not involving a First Amendment activity, there must be expedited processing of juveniles. Or, for example, if there's an out-of-state warrant that might affect the amount of time a person might be held in custody. And so what this creates is, again, something that I think is already in NYPD policy, which is a presumption that those held in custody shall be processed expeditiously and not held for prolonged detention. As my colleague had mentioned earlier, discipline for misconduct, the disciplinary matrix shall be amended to add an aggravating factor to excessive force cases if it is engaged in during legally protected First Amendment speech. And there has been also a specific clause with respect to the treatment of members of the press. So the NYPD must explicitly acknowledge that there is a clearly established right under the First Amendment to record police activity in public. Officers cannot prohibit the press the right to observe and record protests, including by putting up crime scene tape. And they cannot arrest members of the press or public solely for observing or recording police activity in a public place. And to ensure compliance, NYPD will be required to participate in at least 2 meetings a year to discuss any news gathering to allow the press to make recommendations on policies. I'm going to hand this to my colleague.
Thank you, Board. My name is Elaine Marquez. I'm from the New York State Attorney General's Office. And thank you to my colleagues for providing you with a general summary of some of these substantive provisions that we'll be applying at the protests. And I'll be going over how we'll be ensuring that there is compliance with these provisions. So the first phase where we find ourselves today is mainly making sure that these provisions are, thank you, these provisions are, encompassed in NYPD policy. Jenvin mentioned a number of those are already there in the patrol guide. To the extent that they are not, now is the time that NYPD is going to be drafting those policies and eventually also drafting training curricula. Those will be shared with plaintiffs, and there'll be, an iterative process to finalize those. What we expect to be included in the new policies are the 4-tier response system, the arrest policies, use of force at public demonstrations, again, to the extent not already there, and treatment of members of the press. 45 days after those policies are finalized, phase 2 begins, and this is when the oversight committee that was mentioned earlier will begin its work. They will meet regularly to review and evaluate NYPD's protest responses, in part to facilitate that effort. The DOI will be conducting an in-depth review of 2 protests each 6-month period and make recommendations tied to that review. They must publicly issue progress reports summarizing a review of the NYPD's response to protests, and the city will be providing funding to hire full-time staff to achieve this to the tune of $1.625 million. They will also be providing funding to plaintiffs' attorneys to conduct this oversight work throughout this period, which is, again, a multi-year period. And that includes a fundamental piece, which is the community outreach expert. This person will be responsible for engaging affected communities, incorporating their input. And I'll just emphasize this for the public, that we do want to continue, as we had during litigation, to get that input, the critical input from the folks who are attending and witnessing what is happening at these protests. The Oversight Committee more generally will be overseeing and monitoring the implementation of the provisions we went over and compliance with reforms in this multi-year period. And to give you an idea of who will be sitting on it, the Commissioner of DOI will chair. NYPD's FAA senior executive will be on the committee, as will a representative from the Office of Corporation Counsel, a union representative from either the SBA or DEA, a representative from our office, the New York State Attorney General's office, and 2 attorneys from the remainder of the plaintiffs' groups, either Legal Aid Society, NYCLU, Gray, or Orlon. One report that will be a main focus point for the committee. Any protest, and there's certain criteria set forth in the agreement that would trigger an after-action report. This is a sort of report that allows for the NYPD to measure certain information data about how they responded. Any of those action reports will be created by the FAA senior executive and document exactly how they responded, who the incident commander was, how many folks were deployed, what decisions were made with regards to arrests and the justifications for those, what uses of force, what force was used, and why, if at all, tiers were moved between. All these different elements will be detailed in these written reports, and these will be the subject of much of the committee's review. After the 36th month and the final report from DOI, we move into phase 3. And as mentioned before, it's a 12-month period during which the court will continue to retain its jurisdiction over the agreement. If the NYPD violates terms of the agreement at any time, the plaintiffs may take action to bring the matter to court. And that, again, continues through phase 3. And I'm sure what the board is at least somewhat interested in is what your role is. So the settlement does not confer any changes to your FATO jurisdiction. Explicitly in paragraph 87, it notes that. So NYPD must continue to refer to you, and you will continue, of course, exercising your own jurisdiction over complaints of misconduct related to protest policing. That includes excessive force and abuses of authority. And to the public, if you have experienced police misconduct while demonstrating, there are a number of things you can continue to do, and we encourage it. File a complaint with the CCRB, contact any of the plaintiffs' counsel, again, including the New York State Attorney General's office, Legal Aid Society, NYCLU, or the other consolidated plaintiffs' counsels to report your experience if you believe you would potentially that but you did experience violated portions of the settlement agreement, or of course consult with any other civil rights attorney. So we just want to thank you again for the time you've granted us to go over this, what we believe is a momentous agreement. And we welcome that. I'll turn it over back to you, Chair Rice, and welcome any questions that we could help answer.
Thank you for that very thorough presentation. And I should have said this in the beginning, but to the other members of the board, the materials are before you. I think most of you were able to read along. So thank you for that. I do have quite a few questions, but I do want to give that opportunity to the other members of the board as well. But I think that the first two questions that I have, I can't resist asking. And the first is I wanted to know if there was any conversation about including the CCRB in the oversight committee. If there was any discussion about that and what was concluded. And then I also wanted to know, in terms of the 4 tiers, what was the mindset for what could be either avoided and or included, offset by going to a 4-tier system?
Those are very interesting questions. Molly Bicklin again from the NYCLU. Without getting into sort of some of the discussions behind the settlement agreement, which would of course be confidential, but I think, the entire agreement recognizes the important role of the CCRB in terms of investigating complaints and assuring the accountability and compliance for constitutional policing by the NYPD. And so that remains very significant part of the settlement agreement. But the DOI is there to chair the committee and bring sort of a different investigatory perspective to that compliance committee. With respect to the 4 tiers, the idea, and this is not, it's novel for New York, and bringing it all together we think is momentous, but it is a tactic that has been, literature tried from other places to bring sort of a right-sized approach to policing. I think, look at some of the reports coming out of the 2020 protests, including the DOI's report on the police response, including the Corporation Council's report, the CCRB's own report of sort of what happened. We see escalation when there are, enormous numbers of police officers who are often responding, things can get out of hand very quickly. And so rather than, sending the maximum number of police officers to any First Amendment activity, the idea is to right-size that approach, to eliminate some of the escalation and try to reduce some of the escalation that was seen during the 2020 protests from sort of flooding the zone in that way. And sometimes the crowd reactions, it was an escalatory response as opposed to a de-escalation response. There are hundreds of protests that happen in New York City, I mean thousands each year, and most thankfully do not lead to violence, to brutality, to unconstitutional policing. And so we want to learn from those, and often it's those where there is not sort of that outsized police response, and that's what that 4-tiered response is looking at.
Do any members of the board have any additional questions? Any additional questions?
Yeah, I do. First, on the schedule, where are we at? It says the settlement was approved February of 24. Then there's phase 1. Do you know when phase 1 is going to end and when it's going to go to phase 2, what the schedule is?
Jen Wong from Legal Aid. So we are currently in phase 1. The timeline that was provided is really just a general history. I don't have a strict schedule to provide to the board, unfortunately. Just that we are currently in phase 1, that policies are being changed. Those are being finalized. Once those are finalized, training will be implemented. And once that has been done, 45 days out from that, we will be in phase 2. My understanding is that we are moving as expeditiously as we can at this point, but policies must be changed first and training must be rolled out.
Second question, the First Amendment, the FAA, the First Amendment. Exactly. that's in person, right?
Correct.
And that person's approval is required before you go to tier 2 or to tier 4.
Correct.
What happens if, as happened in 2020, there are multiple incidents across the city?
This requires, this doesn't take away the role of the incident commander, who is the person who is on the ground at the demonstration. It merely requires that the incident commander consult with the FAA senior executive, and also that these decisions and the factors that go into these decisions are actually recorded.
So it's that FAA senior executive, will that person have staff?
They can. I think they, yeah, they.
Can that power be delegated? Because I can envision a situation, there's a demonstration in every borough and that person can't, in this form, contact with the incident commander.
Yes, they can have a designee.
And so I have some of the questions along this line. Is it going to be a uniformed member of service or a civilian member of the service?
The FAA senior executive does need to be, I think, ranked captain or higher. Deputy chief.
But it's, so in theory, a deputy commissioner is senior to a captain, but is not a uniform member of service. So you're saying it does need to be a member of service.
The NYPD can designate this person.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, do you want to take the mic? Sorry. It's up to the NYPD to designate this person. They do have to be, the settlement agreement provides that it shall be the chief of department or a senior level designee within the chief of department's office, holding the rank of deputy chief or higher, with extensive knowledge of the application of the First Amendment as it relates to protest activity. And this person will then consult with members of the legal bureau and can also have a designee available to assist in overseeing.
So is it going to be? So like in the CCRB, there might be a deputy general counsel who's also the FOIL appeals officer. So would there be someone in the chief of the department's office who's also the senior First Amendment activities senior executive?
That seems likely.
So I have one more question there. And I apologize if I missed it, but at one point in the presentation, you referred to having community affairs officers involved at the tier 1.
Yes.
But then later you referred to protest liaisons. And so is that the same thing as someone who is in community affairs, or is there a subset of community affairs officers that are going to be considered protest liaisons?
It'll be the latter, where there will be a subset. Yeah.
I don't remember which is, so it's a subset of community affairs officers.
Subset of community affairs officers, correct, that would receive additional training on being protest liaisons.
I wanted to ask those folks specifically that are on joining us virtually. Do you have any comments or questions?
A follow-up question on two of the issues that were really highlighted, both in the report of the CCRB as well as in reports from the Attorney General's office. Everyone basically talked about this in the media, and that was the two of kettling and the treatment of members of the press. And so they're highlighted in the agreement, and but I wasn't completely sure of the implementation process and or the accountability. So under the treatment of members of the press, it talks about the NYPD must explicitly acknowledge there is a clearly established right under the First Amendment to record police activity in public. I don't know what explicitly acknowledging means and what it means in the day-to-day interaction of the police with the press in a situation as like that we had in the George Floyd protest.
It's shocking.
believe what Chair you're referring to is paragraph 89, and that's simply will be acknowledged in the patrol guide. For instance, that subsection A says the patrol and or administrative guide shall be updated to acknowledge, so on and so forth, these very clearly established rights. So a number of these provisions are restating what the law is, but will just be more clear in the patrol guide so that, rank and file can see that in we believe they see just more often.
Yes, please.
What are the criteria to establish who's a member of the median as opposed to someone who just shows up with a camera?
So that is also in the guide, both recognizing that a member of the press is not limited to people officially issued Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment press passes, and that the NYPD must set clear standards in its training to ensure that members of the press are able to exercise their rights. And so the settlement agreement identifies certain indicia of what to be a journalist or member of the press, meaning an individual who gathers, reports, and licenses news or content. And to facilitate this real-time investigation or identification of members of the press, the following shall be considered indicia. Visible identification, such as by wearing or carrying a press credential or other press identification, wearing or displaying distinctive clothing, label, or insignias, or logos that identifies the bearer of them as a member of the press. Other indicia may include professional equipment such as cameras, lights, microphones, or audio recorders. They're not exclusive, and a person need not exhibit every one of them to be considered a journalist or member of the press. So the idea here is to update the training to make sure that, identification is not simply one limited press card. There are, several other press identification out there, and to make sure that that training is disseminated to the NYPD.
So there's nothing to stop someone showing up with something on their body that says press. It says I'm press, I get treatment that these other demonstrators don't get.
The NYPD would still be able to exercise their discretion, but some of those indicia would be indicia of whether that person is a working member of the press. So, for example, in one of the cases, one of the plaintiffs was arrested wearing a press card and was a stringer journalist for several significant outlets, but did not have a MOAM press pass, had a State Department press card.
Any other questions from members of the board, either virtually or here in person? I want to thank you, Ms. Bilkin, for that presentation, to the rest of your colleagues. We know you worked very hard in putting together the presentation and also in negotiating the agreement. And so we appreciate your efforts towards building greater accountability for New Yorkers. So thank you so much for that. We are now going to enter into the public comment portion of the meeting. We will begin with those joining us virtually who would like to make a comment, followed by those who are joining us in person. Jahai, do we have anyone who is going to be joining us virtually?
So far, I do not see any raised hands virtually.
Madam Chair, I've neglected in my remarks to remind joining us online or who want to speak here today.
Thank you very much for that. So a reminder about the length of the comments, and if there's anyone here in the room who would like to make a comment, if they would want to make their way to the podium, they can do so.
Hello. My name is Mariana. This is for my daughter's mothers who refuse to have their rights and civil liberties taken from them to alienation. I also would like to say that I support the chair of OIC's requests on March 20th, 2023 for an increase of $30 million $421,570 in the city council budget. This is a budget that has never been as big as it is than it is right now. The previous budget, and since 2015, was $85 billion. It is now $111.6 billion. So 30 million. $421,570 is a good enough budget for this, for the CCRB to be able to be the independent arm of the NYPD investigating any kind of police brutality, excessive force, or any other challenges that police may cause. I don't have a written speech. The only thing I can come up with since my last speech that I mentioned, I quoted Tupac Shakur. This time I want to say Malcolm X said that the most unprotected person in America is the Black woman. The most disrespected person in America is the Black woman. And until I see evidence differently, I'm going to say Malcolm X again and again. We've got to have decorum in our police department. We have got to have respect in our police department. We have got to have those who are willing to protect and serve our communities, to make safeguards for the citizens of our community. And that does not mean using excessive force, using up individuals, especially mothers who are checking on children at the schools, to be shackled at the ankles like a slave, to be shackled at the wrists with no breathing room for your veins to pump blood through them. There's got to be a safeguard. And we keep talking about training, but I think the only training that we really need in our police force is protect and serve. With compassion and integrity, either one. And I'm just gonna, because I have 2 minutes time, I'm just gonna end with this. We have police officers who don't want to be police officers. We have police officers who think that the badge allows them to bully people. Those are the ones that we need to find new jobs for, because we citizens of New York City and state do not pay our police officers to abuse citizens or to use negativity in any form as the citizens of this city. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Moss, for your comments. Is there anyone else who has a comment this evening, if they want to step to the podium? As you heard from our executive director, you have 2 minutes for your comments.
For me, this is my first time. Yes. My name is Elijah McCormick. I'm just a member of the public. This is my first time coming to one of these meetings. And pretty much I got some questions. Is that okay to get right? First question, I have filed a complaint with CCRB and it's been moved up the ranks to APU. Right? And once it reached that, I was researching, trying to find more information about a process APU or how they are chosen to be elected part of the APU. And it's kind of like really like vague. It's like I feel like I've been ghosted on that part, like not really knowing who or what, how it's conducted. So I want to ask about more so transparency provided for the public through the website, the CCRB. The most we get is like 1 paragraph about the APU. And so that was my question. Was there any future, intentions of providing more information?
Thank you, Mr. McCormick, for that question. I'm going to have our executive director talk a little bit more about the APU.
So, Mr. McCormick, once the board votes and substantiates at least one allegation against a member of service in a complaint, if the board recommends a level of discipline called charges and specifications, which is the most serious level of discipline that can be imposed upon a police officer, that complaint then is sent to the administrative prosecution. The administrative prosecution unit was established in 2012 as part of a memorandum of understanding between the New York City Police Department and the CCRB. Before the APU was created, the CCRB would, if the CCRB substantiated misconduct, it would merely send a recommendation to the police department, but then the police department would be responsible for all of the disciplinary matters that happened after the CCRB substantiated misconduct. Now, with the administrative prosecution unit, on these most serious cases, the attorneys for the administrative prosecution unit, which we call the APU, they stand in the shoes of the department advocate. So instead of having an NYPD attorney bringing the disciplinary case at One Police Plaza and bringing those disciplinary charges and prosecuting the disciplinary charges and calling you as a witness as the victim in this case, it'll be a CCRB attorney, APU prosecutor who will be prosecuting that case. And they're not elected, they're hired experienced attorneys who are staff at the CCRB. Some of them are former prosecutors. When I was the first deputy chief prosecutor for the unit when it was created. But we've also hired former defense attorneys to the APU. The current chief prosecutor, who's here today in the front row, Andre Applewhite, is a former defense attorney. And when our attorneys go to One Police Plaza and they're in the trial room, they are going to advocate for the appropriate level of discipline to be imposed on the police officers for the misconduct that they are accused of, that this board has substantiated, but then there's a whole separate subsequent disciplinary process that happens at the department. And so if you wait around, I'm sure Mr. Applewhite would love to talk to you and tell you more about the process and how it affects your case in particular.
Yes, thank you. I was just want to ask that some way, somehow the public is accessible to that, because once I got my decision, that was pretty much APU, closed by CCRB, sent to APU, and that was the most information I got. So I was just asking for more transparency on the website or some way or fashion, maybe doing a receipt and notification of charges substantiated or not. During that process, the person would know more details about, that they're being hired. Everything you just told me, pretty much more details to feel more comfortable with the process.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk with Claire Platt, who's our acting senior communications advisor and who's responsible for our website, about making sure there's more information about the administrative prosecution unit available for everyone on the website. But also I'll talk with Andre and make sure to tighten up the lines of communication to make sure there's smooth transfers between so that you understand what is the next step in the process when the case goes to the APU. So I appreciate you coming out and pointing out that flaw and where we can do better.
Yes, I'm sorry. One more question. I got some more time. All right. I know CCRB is aware of a bill being passed for not being passed, but going through the process of police personal liability insurance, like for holding people, having police officers. It's bill for 3515, S3515, pertaining to police officers having to be personally liably insured when they, know to be a police officer. Is a bill. So basically, if you're not aware, I don't know if CCRB is aware, but if you are part of that, or is there a consensus or agreement upon the views on the bill, if there's a accuracy or backing up for the bill? I think that bill will be very effective when it comes to accountability. So.
So I'm not familiar with the bill, but what I will do is, next month in my remarks, I'll just tell folks what the bill is, so that it's more clear to everyone what's involved.
Okay, that's it. That's all I have. Thank you for the information.
Thank you, Mr.
Does anyone else have any comments? They want to come to the microphone? If not, do we have any old business to come before the board? Any old business? Do we have any new business? Hearing none, I'm going to move that we break into executive session. The agenda for executive session is the board will deliberate on 3 full board cases. The executive director will discuss pending personnel actions, and the general counsel will provide updates regarding pending litigation. Could I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The June meeting of the CCRB is concluded. Thank you.